All right, guys, we have a lot to do this morning, so we're just going to jump right into it. If you got your Bibles, go to Luke 15. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. It will be on the screen for you, but there's also a Bible somewhere in the seat backs in front of you. Luke 15, and we're going to be picking up right there where it all starts in verse 1. Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So we're stopping right there immediately. Our time together is going to get 2 verses in, and then we're going to stop. We're in the middle of this parable series, and Rick has commissioned me with talking about the parable of the prodigal son, and I am very excited to do so because this just so happens to be my favorite parable that Jesus ever told. And this sets the stage for what we are stepping into. Jesus is speaking to a room that is full of sinners and tax collectors. And then somewhere in the back, not all that far off, somewhere in the back are all of the Pharisees. And they're kind of sitting back there with their arms crossed and they're grumbling because Jesus is associating himself with sinners. What are we doing here, Jesus? This is a small note at the beginning of the chapter, but it's important to understand for the context of the story itself. And Jesus then proceeds to tell 3 parables, but these 3 parables all hold the same meaning. If you're familiar with Luke 15, you know it's the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coins, and the parable of the prodigal son. And because we are narrowing down on the parable of the prodigal son this morning, we can go ahead and skip down to verse 11. And he said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to the father, 'Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise, go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to the father, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this, my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." Let's stop there for now this morning. There are 2 movements in the younger son's life. There's 2 major movements we see. There is the leaving and there's the returning. The leaving occurs in verse 12. It says, the younger man said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate I have coming to me.' The son is asking for his inheritance in this verse, which is wild. Like if we think about it for a half a second, when do you get your inheritance? When your parents die. And so what the son is functionally saying to his dad is, 'Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me what's coming to me now. I want my inheritance now.' This would have been shocking to the listeners gathered around Jesus. I can imagine the crowd gasping as Jesus is telling this part of the story, but it actually gets crazier because the father gives him what he asks for. So right off the bat, Jesus throws 2 incredibly shocking instances into this parable. The weight of the father dividing up his property to his sons is felt better in the Greek. The Greek word for this word property that you see in the ESV is actually bios, which means life. So the father literally divides his entire life, his entire livelihood between his two sons. This is humiliating, it's shocking, and it's going to get even worse. Look at verse 13. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. The younger son gets his inheritance and bolts. And I want you to check out the language here. The language used is squandered and reckless. And if you look up the definition of the word prodigal that we see in the title of this parable, you'll find someone who spends their money or resources recklessly, or someone who is wastefully extravagant. And this perfectly describes this portion of the younger son's life. It perfectly describes the younger son's actions once he has received his share of his father's life. And this is where we hit the first bit of personal application within Jesus' story. Guys, anytime we look for happiness or fulfillment in something other than God, we are the prodigal sons leaving home. If we look at the prodigal son, he took a look at his life, he analyzed what he had around him, his family, his home, his work, whatever, and he's like, this is not what I want, this is not fulfilling for me, so give me my inheritance, Dad. I'm going to go look for that purpose somewhere else. And if that is us in this building this morning, we know that movement away from God, guys, always leaves us with emptiness. I know this to be true from my own life. When I was a high school student, I really struggled with this identity crisis of who the heck am I? And I was a kid who grew up in church, and I knew all the answers, and I loved Jesus to the capacity that I was able at that time, but that was not fulfilling I had this hole inside of me. And I'm like, I got to fill it with something. And what I have around right now is not really working. But then I realized I happen to be a decent athlete. And I played baseball. And so what I decided fitted decently into that little hole that I had somewhere inside of me was my performance on a baseball diamond. And that appeared to work for a period of time. But as you guys know, sports go away at a certain point. High school students in the room, sports go away. You get older, your body breaks. I don't care how good you are. The end comes for all of us. So that time came for me when it came time to go to college. And I was left with two choices. I could either play baseball or I could live a functional life. And I'm looking at these two and I'm like, I guess I'm going to live a functional life. So baseball goes away, and that left me in a space where I'm looking around going, who am I now? I had gone away from finding my worth in the Father, and I looked for it elsewhere, and then like all of our idols do, those eventually fail us, and now I'm left to go, what am I? We see the younger son start to understand that emptiness in verse 14. He spends all of his money, because of course he does, and then a famine hits. Look at verse 14. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise, go to my father, and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. So the son starts to come back to his senses here a little bit. But notice that while he's devising this plan to return, he's got this little speech prepared that he's going to give to his father. He's not preparing to come back as his father's son. He's preparing to come back as his father's servant. And I think for us as modern readers of this story, it's not too far of a stretch for us to read these words, put ourselves in the shoes of the prodigal son and go, yeah, you would be feeling a lot of guilt, a lot of shame. And so, yeah, I could see how he would plan to try and come back and ask to return as one of his father's servants. But I need you to understand this morning, this thought on the part of the prodigal son is not solely out of shame and guilt. You see, the prodigal son knew exactly from the beginning what his actions meant. You guys ever heard of a Jewish custom called kazazah? Show of hands. How many of you guys are like, yes, kazazah, yes. You've heard this before. All the students. Good. I'm glad you guys listen to me sometimes. Good. Okay. In Jewish culture at this time, there was a ceremony called kazazah. And basically what kazazah, by the way, translates to cutting off. So in Jewish culture, if a son got his inheritance from his father and then left and squandered his inheritance to Gentiles, upon coming back, there was a ceremony called kazazah, in which his father would break a clay pot at his feet, signifying the immediate cutting off of his son from the rest of the family. So the prodigal fully expects this to be his fate. So he derives this pathetic little plan to ask for his father to take him back, not as his son, but as his servant. He's trying to get out in front of kazazah. And as he practices this speech, we begin the second movement in the story for the prodigal, and that is the movement home. Look at verse 20. And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. This is the most shocking part of the entire parable. This is infinitely more shocking than the son looking his dad in the eyes and saying, "Dad, I wish you were dead. Give me my money now so I can leave." Jesus' listeners would have been expecting kazazah. But instead, the father runs to his son in order to embrace him. And this is shocking for a few reasons. First, running was deeply dishonorable for a Jewish patriarch to do. Now, if you pressed me and you were like, "Jordan, why?" I don't know if I could tell you totally perfectly why, but I could bring up some reasons of why I would think based on dressed apparel, like you're wearing this glorified dress thing. If you're running around, it doesn't look really good, right? I'm not totally sure, but I do know this. Culturally speaking, Jewish patriarchs would not have ran in public. That would have been deeply disgraceful. Second reason this is shocking, the father hugs and kisses his son. And for all the parents in the room, you guys are like, yeah? Where was the son 3 seconds before this encounter? He's rolling around with pigs. He's down so bad that he's like, I want to eat the stuff the pigs are eating. This son is not in a good state to be coming up and being like, "Daddy, hug me." But we see the father embrace his son and kiss his son. Guys, the father did not wait for the son to go clean himself up. His love was not going to wait on his son cleaning himself up. Instead of disowning his son, this is the third point, instead of disowning his son, guys, the father ran to his son. He didn't wait for his son to make his way down the long pathway to the house. It says that while the son was still a long way off, the father saw him and ran to him. Listen to me, guys. The father waited with the expectation that the son would return and then pursued him when he did. And it's in the middle of this gross, smelly embrace between the father and the son that the son starts to attempt his rehearsed lines. Check out verse 21. And the son said to the father, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put on a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this, my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. The son makes an attempt. He gives it a good college try, right? He's like prepared this speech. He gets into the arms of his father, and he's like, Dad, I'm not worthy to be called your son anymore. Hire me as one of your sons. And the father completely disregards this pitiful little speech. And he tells his servant, no, go get the best robe. Go get the best ring. Go get shoes for his feet. Kill the fattened calf. We are celebrating. This is cause for grand celebration. But let me ask you, why? What's the cause for celebration? What's the occasion for the party? The father says, because this, my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And in this moment, church, hear me. That word prodigal, which means wastefully extravagant, can now be used to also describe the father's love and grace for his son. In abundance of what is expected or should be doled out can now be used to describe the grace and love that the Father has for his Son. And this is the grace and forgiveness and the love of God. Booth, could you throw up that photo of Rembrandt's painting for me, please? Famous painter Rembrandt captured this moment in a painting called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And we see the younger son here on his knees in the arms of the father with his head shaved. He's wearing tattered rags. One sandal's broken, one is completely fallen off. He is broken and unworthy of the Father's love and forgiveness, and yet here he is, resting in the arms of his loving Father. The son came back home, and where he expected condemnation, he found grace, forgiveness, love, and rest. But if you keep looking at that painting for a few more minutes, you start to notice that there's more people present. We're going to talk about that in a second, but if you remember the title of today's message, if you get our weekly email, you may have seen it before or when they flashed it for a quick second. The title of my message is Prodigals, as in plural. I think when you hear this passage preached a lot, they usually stop here, right? They stop at the parable of the prodigal son. It's named after the prodigal son. The problem is the father had two sons. He's got two sons in the story. Look at verse 25. Now his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of his servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes and you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The older son comes home, sees the ruckus going on, asks his servant, what is the party about? I didn't know we were having one tonight. And the servant goes, your brother's back. And your father, he killed the fattened calf, and we're celebrating because your brother is back home. And the older son doesn't like it. And much like the first portion of Jesus' parable, something happens here that was meant to be shocking to Jesus' listeners. The older son refuses to come into his brother's party, and the father goes out to beg his older son to come in. And much like it would have been deeply disgraceful for a Jewish patriarch to run in his robes, it also would have been deeply disgraceful for a Jewish patriarch to leave his own party. Forget about this little extra spice sprinkled on top of him begging his son to come into the party. Jesus' listeners would have been taken aback by this, certainly. Instead, what Jesus' listeners would have expected the father to do is one of two things. Either you get your servant to go drag your son in, or you just leave him out there to pout. You certainly don't leave your own function and then lower yourself to a level in which you're asking your son to come into the party. Do you guys see the parallels that Jesus is drawing between the two sons in this story? What are the similarities we're seeing? The father has to go out to them both. He has to invite them both in. These two sons are more alike than they seem. They both have vices. The younger sons is just more obvious than the older sons. Any of you guys watch the show This Is Us while it was like a national phenomenon on the television? Okay, my wife loved that show. Like she likes most emotional dramas. And here is how it works in our house. Julie Lynn will start watching one of these shows and she'll be like, honey, come watch it with me. And I'm like, babe, I'm not super into like the crying and the emotions and like I'm into like man stuff. And so I'm like, I'm good. And then she starts watching and I like linger in the background. Wait, I thought he died. Who's that? What's happening? And Julie will pause it and turn around and be like, you want me to just start the episode over? And I'm like, no, and I run away. In a certain episode of that show, This Is Us, there's two characters having a conversation about one of the characters' husbands, dude named Randall. And one of the characters is talking to Randall's wife, and she says, gosh, he's such a great man. And Randall's wife goes, no, he's not a good man, he's perfect. And then she goes into this beautiful long speech about her husband is this perfect father and husband figure, and it's great. But then she says, but he's not without his vices. His vice is his goodness. When the older son watched his brother leave home to live a new and wastefully extravagant life, he stayed home. He followed the rules. If the younger son's sin, guys, can be categorized as self-indulgence, the older son is guilty of self-righteousness. Tim Keller said this in his book, Prodigal God. Neither son loved the father for himself. They both were using the father for their own self-centered ends rather than loving, serving, and enjoying him for his own sake. This means that you can rebel against God and be alienated from him either by breaking his rules or by keeping all of them diligently. Let's look back at Rembrandt's painting for a minute. In the parable Jesus tells, the younger son's return to his father is this intimate moment between them. But Rembrandt took some creative liberties, obviously, in this moment. And we see several other people standing around the father and the son. Some of them are kind of in shadows. It's hard to figure out what's happening here. But there's this figure on the far right side. And if you look at him for a minute, he kind of looks like the father, doesn't he? Elegant robes, big Duck Dynasty beard. He kind of looks like the father, and the reason he looks like the father is because that's the oldest son. Now, we don't know that for sure, but art historians believe that Rembrandt wanted to get kind of the whole story in one painting, and so they refer to that figure as the oldest son. And do you see where Rembrandt places the older son? He's looking down, not only on his brother, but also on his father. Does this feel familiar to anyone? We started our time this morning reading those first two verses of Luke 15, and it might have seemed a little bit out of context then, but I want you to look back at it now. It starts off this way. Now the tax collectors and the sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." You guys recognize it? In verses 1 and 2, the sinners and the Pharisees are the younger and the older sons. This painting from Rembrandt depicts them both. In Act 1 of this parable, Jesus is speaking to those gathered around him about their sin of self-indulgence. In Act 2, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees listening over in the corner about their sin of self-righteousness. All right, let's get to the end of this thing. Do you guys notice that Jesus ends the story with no resolution? We're not told how this thing ends. Jesus tells this grand epic tale and then goes, all right, see you guys later. The worship team can go ahead and come back up for me, by the way, before I forget to say that. Why did he do that? Why didn't Jesus just give us an end to the story? I imagine, guys, Jesus finishing this parable, and as he finishes the story without a resolution, he turns his gaze over to the Pharisees. He doesn't say anything, but the look on his face asks them this question: are you going to join the party or not? These Pharisees, the religious elite, thought they were better than the sinners because they followed all of the rules. They weren't just good, they were perfect. And Jesus is saying to them, your vice is your goodness, and you need as much of my scandalous grace and love just as much as these sinners do. Jesus is challenging the self-righteousness of the Pharisees, and if we're willing to be honest with ourselves, guys, we can relate to the younger son because we've all abandoned the father in search of fulfillment elsewhere, but we can also relate to the self-righteousness of the older son. We can relate to the Pharisees. The question is, are you willing to admit that? A lot of you guys know, before I was at this church, I was working as a youth pastor at our sister church in a tiny little town called Richville. That church had enough seats that probably it was filled up by like one of our rows, and that might be too many. Little tiny farm town church. Love that church, love the people there. But there was one guy in particular who I identified with and we would laugh with all the time because I had tattoos and he was the only other man in 55 miles that had tattoos. And we would laugh all the time. This guy loved motorsports, okay? If it had a motor in it, he was about it. And so he decided, I'm going to join a Christian motorcycle gang. And I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, it's going to be my ministry. I'm going to join a Christian motorcycle gang. And the running joke from that point on was always, man, Jordan, could you imagine if I just got all my motorcycle gang buddies to come into church on a Sunday? Like little rice farming town church, and then just like, motorcycle gang walks in. And he's telling me about these guys, and he's like, man, so many good dudes, and there's even guys who don't know Jesus yet, and they're just hanging out. And he's like, this one guy, man, he's got tattoos everywhere. And he's telling me about all his crazy tattoos. And he's like, he's got this one, just like, biggest tattoo in the world on his shoulder. And it says, here for the party. Isn't that crazy? My mom used to say that anytime somebody gave their lives to Christ, that God was throwing a party in heaven. And based on this parable from Jesus, I'm inclined to believe her. But guys, God is running towards the lost. He's inviting them in. And for all of us who tend to kind of sit in the back with our arms crossed because we don't think we're getting what we're owed, or perfect justice is not being served, he's inviting us too. Will we come in? Will we join in the celebration? Jesus leaves the story of the prodigal son unresolved for this purpose. Guys, we are left to wonder what the older son will do. And we're left to wonder what we will do. Whether you're the younger son in the building this morning, or you're the older son, or maybe a combination of both, the Father is running to you so that he can cover you with his scandalous love and grace. And I hope you will join the party. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you that your love for us is beyond my comprehension. I thank you that you love me in spite of me, Father, and it's not anything I have done in my works or my cleaning myself up. Lord, when I come to you in filthy rags with shoes missing, shaved heads, smelling like pigs, you pursue me, and you gave your Son up for me. And I thank you that you have done the same for everybody in this building. Father God, I pray that we wouldn't be like the Pharisees in the back with our arms crossed, thinking this is not the way it's supposed to be done, Father God, because our understanding of justice and what's right and wrong is so trivial in comparison to your understanding of justice and what is right and wrong. I pray that we would pursue understanding you better and understanding your love and grace and justice better this morning. It's in your Son's name that I pray. Amen.